Hello, and welcome to Spotlight On, the podcast that brings together business leaders, entrepreneurs, and experts covering a range of topics. I'm Nicholas Barton, founder and CEO of the Barton Partnership. We're an award-winning executive recruitment and consulting solutions firm providing permanent search and independent consulting services across strategy, sustainability and M&A, data and analytics, and transformation and change.
Hello and welcome to our Women in Leadership podcast series. I'm Kiran, Rasoda, Director in our Transformation and Change practice. Joining me today is Jean Oelwang. Jean is the founding CEO and trustee for Virgin Unite and a B team leader. She sits on the advisory council for the elders and the boards of RMI, Just Capital and Virgin Unite. Jean is also the co-founder of Plus Wonder and author of the book Partnering. Jean, delighted to have you on the podcast today. Thank you so much for making the time. As the president and founding CEO of Virgin Unite, can you start by sharing a bit about its mission and impact?
Absolutely. And firstly, just a massive thanks to you, Kiran, and to the Barton Partnership for having me. I'm so delighted to be here. And Virgin Unite, we're like this little entrepreneurial engine that really focuses on how we change unacceptable issues and systems for good. And we do that in a whole host of ways. We're not about one issue. We're about the how, where are the gaps, where are the things that are so unacceptable that need long-term change. And we really do that in four ways. One is backing unbelievable frontline entrepreneurs. Like there's this amazing woman, Topeka Sams, for example, who's helping women when they come out of prison to get internships in companies. Extraordinary leader. And so we find those great folks and then help lift their work. And then the second thing is we bring together these extraordinary collectives of leaders. Like, for example, we incubated the Elders some 18 years ago now, which is a group of global leaders that was started by Mandela and his wife, Graça, and Archbishop Tutu, really to come together as a collective. There's about 12 of them, led by Mary Robinson from Ireland now, that focus on how do they work behind the scenes and in front of the scenes with no other agenda but that of humanity and the planet. And then the third thing we do is really focus in on how do we shout about unacceptable issues. So how do we use our voice to go out and shout about unacceptable issues? And we do that on all kinds of fronts, like ending the death penalty globally. We were just recently in Ukraine in June and August, and I left Ukraine, I guess, with two overwhelming feelings. One is just outrage that is happening. But then the second was just awe and inspiration for the people, the Ukrainians on the ground. And I remember going to visit this one village and their houses had all been bombed. And one family showed me in their backyard where they had dug a hole that was about 3 feet high and 6 feet wide and hid in that hole for a week while their house got bombed. But what was beautiful, Kiran, at the end of the story, he talked about when they came out and they saw how their house was destroyed and all their neighbors saw their houses were destroyed. Rather than just going back and building their own house and not thinking about their neighbors, they all came together as a community and started to live in the houses that were livable and then help each other build their houses back. And you just saw that sense of collective community across the whole country. It was extraordinary.
I mean, that really does put things into perspective, doesn't it? Is Ukraine been a focus for you most recently with just what's going on? Has that been where Virgin's been putting a lot of its efforts?
We have focused a lot there in the last year, but we've also focused a lot in other crisis areas. There's about 58 conflicts globally happening right now. We're also focused in places like Myanmar, with the Uyghurs, with the Rohingya. So we're focused on a number of different conflict areas around the world. Ukraine has certainly been one of them. And in Ukraine, we've really been focused on working with some amazing partners like Howard Buffett has now, I think, invested something like 300 million into the country to help with the agricultural sector, help make sure that people had generators for heating, help make sure that they had the basics like food. And so we've had the great privilege of working with him and great frontline partners like Superhumans that are working. When we were there last, as you can imagine, lots and lots of people are losing limbs very sadly because homes are being mined, farms are being mined. So there's this amazing organization called Superhumans that wants them not to be seen as victims, but wants to get them the very best prosthetics so they can be seen as the heroes that they are, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole world.
So prior to Virgin Unite, you spent almost 2 decades working in telecommunications. Be really keen to understand what ignited that shift to not-for-profit and how did that move come about?
Yeah, I had the great privilege to have a career in telecommunications when it was a little bit like the Wild West, when they were just starting up mobile phone companies. And I took a couple what I would call disruptive detours in my life. And I can remember I had this great job in telecommunications working for a company called GTE. And I found this opportunity to go and work in a homeless shelter for teenagers and refugees in Center City, Chicago. And I can remember, Karen, everyone saying to me, don't do it. It's going to ruin your career. You'll never get back into the corporate world. And, I was so happy that I didn't listen to that advice, because that year was probably one of the most transformational of my life. And so I went in to work with these homeless teenagers in Center City, Chicago. And it was firstly, again, just shocking that there was something like 70,000 young people living on the streets. But secondly, I think what I really learned there is that our systems weren't working, like the business sector, the not-for-profit sector, the government sector weren't working together. So these young people were falling through the cracks. So I think that was one pivot. And then I made another disruptive detour where I decided I wanted to work international in telecommunications. And one of the places I landed was MTN in South Africa in the mid-90s. And when I went there, I can remember we had these prepaid services that were, again, you can tell how old I am because it was that long ago, and it was just first prepaid cards. But we launched this prepaid card into South Africa, and we actually made our annual sales target within a month. It was amazing. And we went into the townships to find out what was happening. And everyone was using them to cell phone calls out of briefcases, out of trailers. It was this extraordinary entrepreneurial kind of upliftment. And it was just, again, a really important reminder about the role that business can play in driving change in the world. And then the last disruptive detour I made was I was working for Virgin Mobile in Australia. And I was the joint CEO of the organization. And I was in the car with my boss, who was Richard Branson at the time. And I remember overhearing him say, "Oh, I want to do more philanthropically and in the foundation side." And so I went home and pulled together a business plan about what Virgin could do in that impact side, sent that to him. And I remember getting a call from him and agreed that I would come to London and help him start the foundation Virgin Unite. And I remember hanging up the phone, dancing around the house, because this was, to me, one of the most extraordinary opportunities, because it was that combination of business, not-for-profit, and government all coming together. So I was very happy that I took those disruptive detours in my life.
He's quite an interesting character, I guess, the fact that you can put something together and say, actually, I want to take your idea further.
Yeah, he's an extraordinary human being. I mean, I've worked with him now coming on close to 22 years. And I think he's someone that just takes risks. We all joke because he's called Dr. Yes, because he always says yes to things. So if you come up with a plan and you bring it forward. But I've also learned so much from him just about taking risk and going big and, not thinking of the downside, but thinking of the possibilities. So yes, making sure you cover your risk, but making sure you also have an eye on the possibility and the potential to do audacious things. And also just the importance at work of joy and play. I remember when I first started to work with Richard, I can remember I came from very corporate America. And so I was blue suit, totally buttoned up all the time. But also I thought, okay, when we do these gatherings, I thought, okay, we have to work from 8 a.m. through to 6 p.m. And he kind of tore that all up. And he said, no, we're going to work from 8 to 12 when we're at these gatherings. And in the afternoons, we're just going to really get to know one another. And I think that made such a big difference in the relationships. And it actually made us more productive.
Wow, that's interesting. The initiative you lead, 100% Human at Work, is focused on the belief that businesses need to think of people as humans and not resources. How important is purpose-led leadership, and what does good leadership look like to you?
I think purpose-led leadership is probably one of the most important things in the world right now. And if you look at the latest Edelman Trust Barometer, it was really clear in there that consumers, there was something like 68% were purchasing from companies that had a purpose and had a meaning. And the same with employees. It was close to this, around the same, 69% of employees wanted to work for a company that had a purpose and had meaning. And so I think we're seeing this huge shift right now that companies who don't put a focus on purpose will actually not be able to attract consumers and not be able to hold their team members. And I think for me, good leadership is really human leadership. which is why I'm so excited about 100% Human at Work. And we have about 600 companies in this network testing and trialing ways that they can become more human. And I don't know, Kiran, if you saw that latest Gallup poll that basically said that 20% of people were engaged at work. So 80% are disengaged.
Yeah.
And that figure just astounds me, because can you imagine if we turned that upside down and 80% of people were engaged at work, what a different world we would live in. From a perspective of mental health issues would be definitely minimized because someone's going to their work feeling like they have meaning and purpose. And also we'd be able to tackle many of the issues that we're not facing right now that are interconnected. And I almost feel like we have forgotten about the human side of work, and we've almost thought of people as numbers on spreadsheets rather than whole human beings. And we need to re-energize that in our companies and figure out how we incentivize boards, how we incentivize leaders to really think about whole human beings rather than about that person as a resource. And I'll share two quick stories with you. One was, it just made me realize how important this sense of human leadership is. I was at a university recently. It's probably about a room of about 500 students. And we were having a conversation about what it means to be morally courageous in the workplace. And I asked the room, who do you know are examples of morally courageous leadership in the world in any capacity? And not one of them could raise their hand, which was a shock. I think we're lacking that. And I think we have an opportunity in companies to figure out how we spark more morally courageous leaders and how do we celebrate those leaders that are doing great stuff. And I think another story was just, we were at a medical conference and doing a presentation about purpose, about partnership, and about human leadership. And at the end, one of the doctors stood up and he said, "That's all great, but that's the soft stuff. I get measured on the hard stuff." Okay. And it was again a reminder of that's not good enough. We need to figure out how we make the soft stuff, the hard stuff in our incentive structures, how we reward people, because people in the world want that from us. It's so clear now. And I think COVID has made that even more relevant.
You previously talked about how values that were once considered too female are now suddenly vital. Can you talk about this concept of women-led principles in business and what organizations can be doing to create inclusive cultures which celebrate these values?
Yeah, I think, firstly, I should say right up front, I think many men have what I would call women-led principles, or sometimes I call dire principles. So I don't think that it's just women, but I feel like the good thing is we're starting to see workplaces change a lot right now. I think this next generation is coming in and demanding that. I think having more diversity in the workplace from all types of cultures, geographies, races, is just starting to change workplaces for the better. And people are starting to realize that that's what makes your business successful, is having that diverse group of people that are going to see the world from all different angles. And I feel like, there's a big question about why we don't have more women in leadership roles, because I think it's only something like 10% at the top of companies still, for example. And I feel almost like the values that a lot of women bring to the table have not been valued in the most effective way yet. And I also feel, and I don't know if you see this too sometimes, is that women often don't want to lean into a culture that isn't human. So they'll opt out before they'll change their values and fit in with something that perhaps doesn't work for them. And it goes back to what we were just talking about how we make what people consider often the soft stuff, the hard stuff. And I can remember when in my very, very first job, I had a very well-intentioned boss. It was in the telecommunications sector. And I can remember he gave me 2 books when I first started. And the first one was The Art of War. And this was, again, some 30 years ago now, longer than that. But I can remember as a young female thinking, oh my God, I have to figure out how I can survive in this war that's the corporate world. And then the second book he gave me was The Joy of Cooking, just in case I didn't make it in The Art of War. And I still have those 2 books that remind me just, again, how we immediately stereotype women when they're coming into the workplace. And It also reminds me that we need to start calling out the absurd. I don't know, Karen, and many women that are listening to this, but I can't tell you the number of times people have asked me to build a business case on why we need more diversity or why we need more women in the workplace, which is one of the most absurd questions I've ever heard in my life, of having to justify your existence in a workplace. And so I think it's calling those things out, that they're absurd. And I think realizing that the only way we are going to succeed as companies, we're going to succeed as humans, we're going to succeed in tackling our issues, is if we figure out to radically collaborate at a level we cannot even begin to imagine. And I remember when one of my first jobs, I was really nervous at this event with this group of leaders in the company. And I nervously was like holding this glass of water and went up to this leader and I said, how can I be successful in this company? What advice would you give me just starting out? And he looked at me and he said, you need to bleed blue. And that was the color of the logo of the company. And I said, okay, that's an interesting response. And then he went on to say, see everyone else in this room, you need to be better than them. You need to outcompete them. And it was just such the wrong message that we give again and again in our companies, that it's about individual achievement and cut through. And really, it should be about how do we figure out how we can lift each other up the ladder rather than scrambling on top of each other. And so I think that what would be considered female collaboration and parting is probably one of the most important things we need to do. And also, I think one of the things that I find women are really good at, because they have to do this, is do long-term thinking. They have to be thinking about what is the future for my family, my children. And we've come so far in companies where we're just thinking about short-term profit. So how do we turn that upside down and start to think more in a long-term way that will drive better behaviors in the short term? And how do we be open and transparent about that? And I think ultimately that starts with listening to one another.
And do you see, because you work across a huge number of organizations and you have exposure to a lot of people, a lot of different people, a lot of well-known and people that are deserving of the positions they hold. Do you see that changing?
You can definitely see now that there's pockets of that. Like I have the really good fortune to sit in the B team as one of the B team leaders. Yeah. And it's a group of about 25 leaders in that group. And you can see that they've actually become successful, not from competing with others, but collaborating with others and listening to others. People like Paul Pullman, who was the head of Unilever for many, many years, or Arianna Huffington, who was the head of Huffington Post. The values that they held were about people, about collaboration, about listening. Or my boss, Richard Branson, right now, he's so focused on the people in the organization. He always talks about starting with your employees and making sure that your employees are happy, and that will then flow through the rest of your organization. And I really believe that that's true. And I think we're seeing a lot of really interesting stuff with companies collaborating with other sectors. So with the not-for-profit sector, also with the government sector. And in that same Edelman Trust Barometer, it was really interesting because 40%, and they interviewed something like 33,000 people in 28 countries, and 40% of people felt that the moment is now for companies to start collaborating with government in a radically different way in order to solve some of the problems that we're facing, whether that's things like climate change or inequality. So I feel like, again, the whole world is in a very different place than it was, say, 3 or 4 years ago. It's almost as if someone has smacked a big red reset button on the wall, and people are starting to realize that we need to change our underlying systems. And the only way we're going to do that is to collaborate.
Yeah, no, definitely. I can relate to that. Your book, Partnering, Forge the Deep Connections That Make Great Things Happen, shares a number of lessons from more than 60 of the world's most remarkable partnerships. What are the key principles for effective partnerships?
Yeah, and this journey of writing this book was amazing because it's not my wisdom. I went out and sat at the feet of 60 of some of the world's greatest partnerships of all kinds: business leaders, romantic, friends, family, and also large-scale collaborations. Right. It was an amazing journey, just soaking in that wisdom. And they had 2 things in common. One was the longevity of their relationship. And the second is that they had used their partnership and their relationship to make something much greater happen in their world or their life and the lives of others. And what was amazing, Kiran, is almost as soon as we started to do these interviews, we started to see these beautiful patterns start to emerge across no matter what type of partnership. And that's what we call the 6 degrees of connection. And they're things like making sure you have a something bigger. And all of these apply not just to us as individuals in our lives forming partnerships, but also to our companies, to things that we want to do to change the world. And that was one of the most important ones, was this concept of something bigger and having that North Star that really lifted the partnership or the company above any drama, because you always had that focus on the North Star. And you could see that with Ben and Jerry's, for example. They didn't want to just start an ice cream company. They wanted to start a company that was going to change the world. And that's what they did. And then you saw these other beautiful parts of the 6 degrees, this ability to learn to be all in, to have each other's backs, and to really have that level of trust. And a third one, which was around creating this right ecosystem of virtues and values. And you've probably been there before. I've been there before, but so many companies come up with their values. They paste them on the wall.
Yeah.
We're done. And what was beautiful about these partnerships and companies is they really embedded them at the core of, and they lived them. There were things like 6 of them came up: respect and trust and empathy and generosity. And then the other really interesting degrees were around how do you create what we call the magnetic moments, those things that are going to keep you connected, whether it's as a company or a partnership. And then how do you learn how to celebrate friction? And it wasn't that they were devoid of friction. They put tools in place to learn how to turn it from something that was going to blow up your partnership to something that would deepen it. And then how do you then take those deep connections and ladder them up to larger collaborations?
I know you've touched upon some of your observations from these remarkable partnerships, but were there any surprising lessons that you can share with us that you thought, wow, your aha moments for this?
Yeah, there was lots of those aha moments. I think one of them was that some of the best partnerships were radically different people. And I can remember there was these 2, Cornell West and Robert George, one far left, one far right. And they just had the deepest friendship and love, even though they had radically opposing views. And they were able to hold that space of respect, know that they respected each other, even if their views differed. And they said something beautiful to me at the end of the interview. They said, go find a friend that unsettles you and make sure you have friends that unsettle you so you're thinking differently. So there was a lot of those things that really surprised me. I think the other thing that surprised me was the amount of time these people put into rituals and traditions and practices to keep them connected. And like one that I love that Airbnb had was called Elephants, Dead Fish, and Vomit, which I never thought I'd put those 3 words together in one sentence.
Please explain.
So it's this beautiful ritual where they got together every month. I think it was every month or every week. And they got together as a team and they said, okay, we're going to have this very safe space and we're going to talk about the elephants in the room that everyone's ignoring and not bringing up. We're going to talk about the dead fish that we all know about that are sitting in the corner that never get resolved. And then we're going to talk about the vomit. And that's the stuff you just need to get off your chest that day so that you just talk about it and you open up the space to have a conversation around it. And they talked about how this helped them build this trust and this sense of transparency and this sense of deep connection with one another. And so I actually stole that. And we did that with my team quite a bit because it's a fantastic. So there was lots of rituals like that. And then the last thing that really surprised me and helped me as a human being was your point that you just brought up, Kiran, which was celebrate friction, because I think I never realized how bad I was at it until I started to listen to these folks. And they put in place all these tools. Like one of them, for example, was whenever you're going into a disagreement, just pause and think about the why, like why that person's coming from that place. But then also in your head, think about, ask yourself the question, maybe that person is right. So you're going into the conversation, not in a defensive mode, you're actually trying to think about it from their angle. And another group, Sangu Delhi and his brothers from Golden Palm Investments, they talked about how they used to play this hard question game. So they used to swap positions when they were in an argument and then ask each other hard questions back until they came to an understanding of where the other person was coming from. And then they talked, Bertrand and Andre that did Solar Impulse talked a lot about a third way. So how do you come into a disagreement, but realize that there's a third way on the other side, and it's going to be a better way than either of you are coming in with? But one of my favorites was something where I interviewed some partnerships that I had worked with for many years, and I knew that they had had friction in their relationships. And I kept on trying to dig for it, because when I first started this process, everyone said to me, get the fights, find that everything, you need to ask some questions about how they're arguing, why they're arguing. But what was really interesting is that when I started to try to dive into that, they didn't often talk about it. And It wasn't because they didn't want to be honest or transparent. What I found is two things. One, as I mentioned, they had created these tools to lift above the drama, so it didn't become destructive. But then second, they had this beautiful thing that we ended up calling positive amnesia, where they didn't want to hurt the other person because they cared about them so much. So they would go through these arguments, come out the other side, and then literally forget about them and not bring them up again. So they didn't keep on recurring and actually festering. They literally let it go and had positive amnesia, or one of them called it, remember the other 99 things that you love about the other person.
Well, that's such a good way of looking at things. I think when people have disagreements, just thinking about maybe they might be right, just takes you out of that restrictive space, almost unbalances the whole argument, doesn't it?
Yeah. And it comes back to that point of deep listening, because I think we go into a discussion often so focused on how can I prove my point, that we're not even listening to the other person, and we're not even understanding what they're saying. And I think if you just take a breath and you pause and you really deeply listen and you ask yourselves those questions when you're going in, it really helps make it a more productive, even if you disagree in the end, it helps it make a more productive discussion.
It just all goes back to what you're saying at the beginning about just being more human. No, thank you for that. That's really great insights. You've talked about the imperative of hyperconnectivity to drive human achievements. Can you talk more about this concept and why it's so important today?
Yeah, I guess I feel like we have become hyper individualized. From the time we're in school, we're taught we have to win the gold star, have to be the top of the class, have to be the top of the company, have to be the top of our sports team. And when you step back and you think about it, we invest very little time in figuring out how we collaborate, how we partner with each other to lift each other. It's almost nothing in our school system, and also in the training for our companies. If you think about how we're incentivized, it's usually a bonus on how we do as an individual rather than how we do as a team or as a collective. And so I feel like all of these things in the world have pushed us in these positions to be so disconnected and hyper individualistic. And I think we're seeing that play out on a global stage. We're seeing it with countries going back to be focusing just on their country. We saw it in the pandemic, very sadly, when we were doing a lot of work with the Africa CDC during that time. And it was heartbreaking that they could not get access to vaccines because other countries had secured them all. And and even though they had money to pay for them, it was just shocking to see how focused we were on self-interest. And I think that's one of the fundamental root causes of why we are in the place we are in this world of fear and division. And also why our companies have become places that 80% of people are disengaged in, is because it's so focused around self-interest and they don't feel part of something bigger and part of a collective. And I feel like we have a real opportunity as humanity right now to turn that upside down and really, particularly in our companies, re-energize that sense of being connected to one another. And you can see when we do that, one beautiful example is it's a group that I spent 6 years talking to. We're able to sit here. There's not much sunshine out here today in London right now, but there was this morning, and we wouldn't have been able to go out in the sun if it wasn't for the community that protected the ozone layer. And that started in 1974 with two friends, extraordinary scientists, Mario Molina and Sherwood Rowland. When they found that there was this problem with the ozone layer, they alerted the whole world. They felt so passionate about it. And then instead of people embracing them, they attacked them. So for a decade, they had to weather unbelievable abuse, saying that, undermining their work, pulling speaking engagements for them, but they kept on going. And what they did that was beautiful is they built this extraordinary community of government leaders, of not-for-profit leaders, of business leaders, that all came together. And then that was the birth of the Montreal Protocol in the late 80s and 86. And if it wasn't for that Montreal Protocol, where countries from all over the world came together to agree that they were going to ban the CFCs that were destroying the ozone layer, we would not be able to step outside without getting immediately sunburnt. And so I think we have examples of where, as humanity, collectively, we've come together and showed the power of that interconnected work that we can do, rather than where we sit today, which is so focused on self-interest.
Yeah, no, definitely. What advice would you give to the next generation of women starting out in their careers or moving into their first leadership roles or onto their first board level position?
Yeah, I guess I'd say a few things. I think, firstly, don't be afraid to take disruptive detours. Don't be afraid to follow your curiosity, your passions. So many times you get told by people, you can't do this, or you have to do this, or this is the only right career path. And I think that's really a load of rubbish, to be honest. I think you have to follow what your path is. And part of that should be these disruptive detours where you're learning, and that will take all different shapes and forms for different people. And I think, secondly, I think something that we don't talk about very often, but is surround yourself with incredible partners. Really think hard in your life which relationships you want to invest in, and make sure that you have people there that are going to help you step into the very best version of yourself, whether that's your romantic partner, whether that's your friendships, or whether it's the people within your company. Make sure that you really think of the ones that are going to have your back, that are going to be all in with you, and that are not going to drag you down. And again, I think as women, sometimes we don't think about that enough when we're growing up, when we're gathering our friend circles. And we don't think about who are the ones that are going to challenge us too. Who are the ones that are going to push us to be our best selves? So making sure that we're surrounding ourselves, not with people that are just like us, but people that will help us become the best version of ourselves. And then I'd probably say, lastly, don't take yourself too seriously. I look back in my career and I think I wasted lots of years taking myself way too seriously and not having enough joy. Because I think, Kiran, I was so focused, and I'm sure you and other females out there can relate to this, is I was so focused that if, as a female, I needed to do 10 times better than everyone else around me, and I was so focused that I had to have the right answers, I had to do the right thing, that I was petrified to make a mistake. And because of that, I think for me, I wish I hadn't done that. I look back on that time in my life and I wish I just relaxed and not taken myself too seriously, and then had some more joy in my life. So that's the last thing I would say, is make sure you have joy in your life, and make sure you surround yourself with the people that are going to bring you that joy.
Jean, thank you so much. What a lovely note to finish on.
Well, thank you so much, Kiran. And thanks to Barton Partnership for doing this podcast as well. It's exciting to see more podcasts giving women voices all over the world.